Liberalism's Androgynous Body by Marc Barnes. The European Institute for Gender Equality argues that gender identity is, quote, each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the sex assigned at birth, end quote. Gender, for its part, is redefined as the result of one's gender identity and one's sex assignment at birth. If my deeply felt experience of my own gender identity is as a male, and I have been assigned by my parents, hospital staff, and community at large to the sex female, then I am a transgender male. If I have been assigned to the sex male, I am a cisgender male. If I am unsure of my gender identity, this obscurity is present in the term signifying my gender. I may be gender queer or gender fluid, depending on my definitions of the terms. This schema has been implemented by liberal governments because it allows people to speak of gender without giving priority to any single group of people, most obviously cisgender or non-transgender people. These individuals are no longer defined as a natural or proper articulation of the gendered human person. They occupy one possible position among many. They are those kinds of beings whose gender identity happens to match the sex they were assigned at birth, and nothing more. The goal of political liberalism is to strip the world of any social hierarchies beyond that of the individual under the state. This is obvious in its persistent reduction of the family from a genuine source of authority to a reproductive, productive, and taxable unit under the state. It is obvious in its relativizing and destruction of the authority of the church to that of the state. It is obvious in our growing cultural horror over any acts of justice, obedience, or vengeance that are not mediated through a state-sanctioned police force. Gender identity is another instance of this leveling process. Instead of man and woman, the world is redescribed as a field of pre-sexed units undergoing various moments of gendering through a combination of what others say about them, sex assignment at birth, and what they say about themselves, gender identity. Even as it redescribes the world in terms of an infinite number of genders, the theory assures a rigorous sameness at the root of all of them. We are all that X which is gendered. This is not a new idea. In his study, Androgynous Democracy, American Modernity and the Dual-Sexed Body Politic, Aaron Sheen argues that the image of a being that is neither male nor female, but both or neither, has served as an essential role in building up nation-states. It serves as a symbol of both civic unity and the fundamental sameness of human beings that allows for their homogeneous governance. The vision of men and women at the level of their participation in the state as fundamentally pre-gendered citizens allowed for the successful emancipatory introduction of women into the body politic as voters. As Thomas Lacour suggests, the liberal subject that evolved out of John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Adam Smith was neuter in order to represent the universality of God-given natural rights. Social contract theory at its most abstract postulated a body that, if not sexless, is nevertheless undifferentiated in its desires, interests, or capacity to reason. In striking contrast to the old teleology of the body as male, liberal theology begins with a neuter individual body, sexed but without gender, in principle of no consequence to culture, merely the location of the rational subject that constitutes the person. Gender identity is a contingent, felt sense of belonging to a few recognized social categories, nominally demarcated as male, female, some negation, or some combination of the two. To have gender in and through this model preserves the priority of the genderless or androgynous individual, that pre-gendered X, which receives, rejects, or consents to being male, female, both, or neither, as a metaphysically subsequent modification of the individual person. This anthropology is well suited to liberal governmentality, which deals with its subjects universally as right-bearing individuals rather than women as opposed to men. Andrew Willard Jones argues that Because real difference between persons is understood as the source of conflict, and so also economic friction, liberalism seeks to map onto all human interaction this sovereign matrix of abstract personae, properties, rights, and contracts, thus eliminating real personal difference. Nowhere is this more obviously achieved than in reducing the male-female difference to androgyny. Likewise, the gender identity model has a certain spiritual affinity with liberalism. By its own self-description, philosophical liberalism is premised on the rejection of traditional forms of authority in exchange for the practice of individual consent. This is the myth of liberal revolution, with its exchange of kings and queens for social contracts established by the consent of the governed. It is the logic by which children are raised within liberal nation-states, trained to become masters of their own free will, able to freely consent to the institutions of liberal society. Gender identity satisfies the prerequisites of a genuinely liberal institution, in that it operates within this same narrative structure. The gender binary and rigid gender roles are the pre-existing forms of governance that do not rely on the consent of the governed, but begin socially and psychologically governing the thoughts and actions of individuals before they have developed the rational self-will necessary to consent to or revolt against them. The gender identity model is an argument that these traditional gender forms are contingent and only govern a people insofar as they consent to them. The emancipatory hope invested in gender identity is part of the broader liberal hope of emancipation from all forms of authority that cannot be reducible to an original moment of consent. In adopting the gender identity schema over and against a philosophy of substantive gender, one is able to participate in the French and American revolutions on the level of the naked flesh. Within liberal politics, people are unified not by the pursuit of a common good, nor by common belief, but by a persistently reiterated agnosticism on otherwise divisive theological and philosophical claims. To take the most obvious example, liberalism purports to tolerate all religions by absenting itself from the religious sphere, declaring the public sphere to be neutral in respect to the question of God and his relationship to man. This appearance of agnosticism is really agnosticism, a series of positive claims, belief in which is enforced by the diffused power of liberal states. In fact, liberalism claims that man is a kind of being whose political nature is irrelevant to his relationship with God. That true religion is found in private choice rather than corporate profession. That social orders ought to be established and preserved within a sphere of rights, duties, and activities that would be what they are whether or not God exists, and so on. Liberalism masks these doctrines concerning man, God, and the world as a lack of any doctrine. By reducing gender to a private, individual felt sense, they do the same. As a tool for the achievement of negative universality, liberalism simply states that all genders are welcome, that there shall be no discrimination, that no particular gender is better than another, and no other. This assumes and masks a positive doctrine regarding the human person, namely that he is fundamentally a pre-gendered X, available to being gendered by power, whether one's own or another's. This, then, is the anthropology presumed and masked by our liberal institutional definitions. Human beings are fundamentally androgynous. This vision of sex and gender as the constructed appearance of a fundamentally sexless and genderless being is not new. It is already present in humanity's myths of primal androgyny, which would describe all sexual difference as being neither a natural kind nor anything essential to the subject, but an accidental and contingent modification of the androgynous subject by a usually malicious power. If this is the case, then the Jewish and Christian anthropology, which asserts sexual differentiation from the beginning over and against the doctrine of primal androgyny, is directly relevant to our debates regarding gender identity. Indeed, once the attempt to keep the peace through a liberal regulation of gender categorization to a private sphere is abandoned, all that remains are two rival doctrines. Human beings are fundamentally androgynous, and human beings are fundamentally male or female. Liberalism's philosophy of gender identity is best understood as a renewed assertion of the Gnostic ideal of the primal androgyne, which is itself a reassertion of the androgynous milieu into which the authors of Genesis fired their radical, contradictory doctrine. Male and female, he created them. It results not so much from an advance in learning or theory, but from a growing distaste for the revelation of the Bible. It will be the goal of this series to show how the Judeo-Christian tradition leveled a radical critique of a prevalent androgynous anthropology and should continue to do so today.